What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you guys know that this is another 2-hour Megamix. If you guys are enjoying the daily uploads and these longer videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this one. I think about 1,500 likes is a good goal for these longer 2-hour videos. Doing all of the above really helps out the channel and to make sure that I can continue to do these for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts of making these videos is reading your guys' thoughts on the stories therein. Without further ado guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you guys again at the end of the video. Have a great day. This happened about 7 years ago when I went to Disneyland. I stayed in a hotel that might be affiliated, if I remember correctly. I stayed there for about 3 nights in a pretty big family room. I think that hotel room is haunted, and even a person who's not a believer could have their mind changed if they stayed in the same room I did. That's why I'm here, to try and share my experience and find out if anyone here has experienced anything similar. I was staying in the hotel with my husband and 2 children. We had taken a flight to Disneyland as a treat for the little ones. I noticed something pretty strange about our room. The door to this walk-in wardrobe inside our room would open by itself. No matter how many times I closed it, it would just keep on opening. That's not exactly strange on its own though. Maybe the room was slightly curved or something like that to make it open on its own. But something about this door felt a little different. Whenever I was looking, it would stay shut for as long as it felt like. But the second I looked away or left the room, it would open all by itself. I noticed this was happening. I was in bed and my husband and children were sleeping soundly in the room with me. They hadn't woken up yet. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to scare the children. When my husband woke up that morning, I thought about telling him about the door. The first thing he said to me when he woke up was, "Hey, last night when I was in the shower, someone knocked on the shower door. Was that you? Some kind of prank? Someone snatched away my slippers too. I can't find them anywhere." I told him it wasn't me. I didn't think it was the kids either. I told him about the weird door. I told him about the strange door, and he agreed the hotel was giving off weird vibes. We both felt like we weren't alone in that hotel room, but we didn't particularly feel frightened by what was going on. We kind of joked that if there was a spirit in that hotel room, it was likely the spirit of some sort of mischievous child. We decided to keep it from the kids and just enjoy our vacation. My husband had never been a believer in the paranormal, so it was unusual to hear him talking about ghosts and stuff so casually. We went down to enjoy the hotel buffet in the morning, and naturally, as we left our room, I hung the little sign on the doorknob that said "Do Not Disturb." We were going to eat, then come back, and then go out for the day. When we came back from breakfast, as expected, the door to the walk-in wardrobe was wide open again, and not only that, various towels and other items had been flung all over the room. I turned to my husband and said, "Hey, maybe we should change rooms?" My husband then said that if they let us change, usually we would need a really good reason. I didn't know if ghosts was something they'd accept. He called the front desk and asked for a room change. While they did say this would be possible, the only thing they could offer for us was 2 twin rooms on different floors. That wasn't really great with 2 little ones in tow. I thought about it some more and realized I didn't want 2 separate rooms. It would be difficult to explain to the kids and might scare them. It seemed like everything would be a bit of a headache, so we decided to keep this room and maintain the status quo. We should have changed rooms though. because little did I know another incident would happen that night. My kids showered after their day at Disneyland, and then I did as well. We were all so tired we immediately took a rest on our beds. I was so sleepy I fell asleep next to my daughter. She was 9 years old at the time. After a few hours, I was awoken by the sound of crying. My daughter was up in the bed, crying next to me. I panicked a little and asked her what was the matter. She didn't say anything, so I asked her if she had a bad dream. She shook her head and pointed at the side of the bed near the wall. She said through tear-filled eyes that there was a little girl there, and the little girl was crying because her mother was gone. My husband woke up at that point and came over to comfort her. I had never heard her cry like that before. She was really shaken up, and it sounded like she really believed what she was saying as well. "I hope the girl can find her," she said. "Her mom is probably still at the park." I asked her if she wanted to sleep in the bed with Daddy, and she did. She didn't wake up again that night, but I couldn't get back to sleep so easily. I laid there in the silence, wide awake, when after a while, I began to hear something as well. It was definitely the sound of someone crying. I looked over at my husband, who nodded at me to indicate he could hear it too. It was so scary. Just like my daughter had said, a little girl was crying, and it sounded like it was coming from the same room as us. I felt like I could almost hear a whisper in my ear. "Mommy, I can't find you. I'm lonely. Are you looking for me? I wish you would come and find me." I felt so strange, responding to the empty air. "I'm sure your mom is looking for you. I know you're lonely, so I hope she'll find you soon." All of a sudden, I felt sleepy, as if some kind of weight had been lifted from me, and I passed out. I woke up in the morning and noticed my daughters and husband were sleeping in the same bed I was. Apparently, I had been speaking a lot in my sleep, so they came to be near me in the hopes it would calm me down. Later that morning, we would check out of the room. I can't say whether or not I'm scared of what happened that night. Rather, I have a profound feeling of sadness about the whole thing. Sometimes I wonder if there really is a child spirit still in that room, still crying for her lost mother. My husband and I speak about it all the time. Maybe someone else has had a similar experience? I don't want it to become some big thing, because I feel like some people would misuse that information and maybe give the hotel negative reviews or try to intentionally upset that spirit. Has anything heard of something similar in a Disney hotel? I read online something about a family with serious debt issues who took a last family vacation and then all took part in a suicide in that room. I won't say exactly how, but it's so sad, isn't it? I feel like the family wanted to give their daughter a fun final day before they made their wicked choice. Of course, this could all be unrelated, I suppose. But this is something that happened a long time ago, back when I was a kid. I think I was probably around 7 or 8, and it was sometime in the early 2000s. Back then, we would sometimes have family gatherings at one of my aunt's houses. I had several aunts and uncles who lived in the area, and had a few cousins as well. This aunt in particular probably had the biggest house that was also in a good location. And there was a decent amount of land on our property too. Still, we wouldn't go to her place for all get-togethers, just some of them. I don't even know the occasions of them because I don't remember ever being there for a holiday or anything like that. I really liked to go to her house though, because there were all kinds of fun things to do. She had a really big yard and a couple of four-wheelers. There was also a volleyball court on her property, and inside the house she had big TVs upstairs. The basement had a big gaming setup with a GameCube, and I would play the GameCube with my cousins quite a lot. Sometimes we would watch movies as well. During that time, as a kid, obviously I loved video games. but we didn't actually have any at my house. One time, my parents, brother, and I went to my aunt's house. Several other family members were there. Also, a couple of my cousins, aunts, and uncles. I don't remember a whole lot of what we did earlier in the day. I do remember, though, that we had food upstairs and afterwards we're going to watch a large movie on the TV. Unfortunately for me, it was a movie I had already seen at a friend's house recently. I'm pretty sure it was The Scorpion King or something. I liked the movie, but I was more in the mood to play some video games. We were all sitting on the couches and chairs that were upstairs in the living room. Some kids like me were even sitting down on the floor. Shortly after the movie started, I kind of had to use the bathroom, so I decided to go downstairs and use the one in the basement. It was more private. As I was downstairs, though, I just couldn't help myself. I walked over to the basement living room, where the GameCube was situated. Nobody else was down there, so I decided to just play some games for a little while. I was sure nobody would mind that much. I sat down on this weird gaming chair they had and turned on the GameCube and TV. I popped in a Mario game of some sort. The basement living room was at the bottom of the stairs, and to the left and side there were two large couches and a couple of other chairs facing the TV. To the left of the TV was a sliding glass door that opened up to the backyard. All of the lights downstairs were also off. Things were only lit up a small bit by the TV screen. I could hear the sound coming from the TV upstairs of them watching the movie. I kept the volume low on the one I was using. Soon I was playing on the GameCube and having the time of my life. This only lasted for about 15 minutes though. I remember thinking I just heard a noise coming from outside. I looked over, but I didn't see anything out there. I assumed that my aunt or another family member must have gone outside for a moment for some reason. I kept on trying to play, but only a minute later, I heard more noise and then heard the sliding glass door opening. I looked over, expecting to see a family member, but instead I saw some random guy entering the home. The sliding glass door hadn't even been locked. I don't remember much about how the man looked or what he was wearing. I just knew he had kind of long hair and was still a good ways away from me. After seeing the man enter, I instantly got up and ran for the stairs. I went all the way up, and everyone saw me come running into the living room. Someone jokingly asked me what I was in a hurry for, and I said to everyone how a man had just entered the basement through the sliding door. At first, I wasn't taken very seriously. People thought I must have seen a family member I didn't recognize, or possibly a neighbor who had come over a lot. But after some talking, I remember the movie was paused, and a couple of people went downstairs to check it out. The rest of the night is kind of blurry to me. I just know after coming back upstairs, most of us had to go into the two bedrooms that were up there and lock the doors. The police were called, and we had to wait for them to arrive. I know the man was gone when the police got there, but I'm not sure if he left before the basement was investigated or after. I don't think he stole or damaged anything. I didn't go back down into the basement that night at all, but eventually the police left, and we were able to finish the movie. This remains probably the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. I need some help identifying whatever the hell is here with me. I just got back from a week-long vacation last night, and the same activity from the house I was staying in is now going on at my apartment. I apologize in advance for any incoherence in what I might say. I haven't gotten much sleep in the last week. The house we stayed in was gorgeous, and since my entire extended family was staying, there were 18 people. It was absolutely massive and split into two parts. The old side of the house, roughly just a basement, studio, and 3 bedrooms upstairs, and the newer side. I'm not going to go into much detail about the newer half, as no paranormal activity took place there. It was a really gorgeous house. I was sharing a room with my girlfriend, and since we were the last to arrive there, we got to have the worst room in the entire place. Not only did we get the smallest room in the house, about 10 foot by 10 foot, it was also on the old side, directly in front of the basement stairs. As I had been driving for 6 hours that day, I was pretty tired. I said hello to everyone and quickly climbed into bed to go to sleep. It was around 11 p.m. when my girlfriend got into bed with me. She's quite lucky in the sense she can fall asleep just about anywhere in only 5 minutes or so. She was out within seconds. I started to get this weird, uneasy feeling in my chest. Not necessarily a scary feeling, just an annoying, alert feeling you get when you feel like something's watching you. To help ease my nerves, I hopped into a YouTube rabbit hole. About an hour into my journey, I could tell my girlfriend was having a nightmare. I put my hand on her arm to gently wake her up. As soon as I touched her, she bolted awake screaming and mumbled something about the ghost, then immediately fell back asleep. I was not yet ready to sleep, and safe to say I was sufficiently creeped out by that outburst. I went back down the rabbit hole. About 2 hours went by, when suddenly my girlfriend woke up screaming again, saying the footsteps are close. She then passed out again immediately. I decided maybe I wasn't going to be able to sleep that night. I went right back to YouTube. I saw my girlfriend sit up in bed, but she was still asleep. She moved so she was sitting on the edge and started having a conversation with the corner of the room. Eventually, she laid back down, but not before I was absolutely terrified. Other activity occurred after the first night as well, usually just creaks in the floor and knocks on the wall and door. The only other standout event besides movement around the room happened on the second to last night. Something sat down on the edge of the bed. My first thought in my groggy state was that my cat had jumped up onto it, but then I remembered that I wasn't at my apartment. I sat up just in time to see a clear indentation of something on the edge, lifting up off the bed. It couldn't have been my girlfriend, as she was on the opposite side and nowhere near where the indentation happened. The bed I was staying on was also as firm as a rock, so it would be challenging to push that far down into it. Fast forward one more sleepless night, and I was on the way home after a long day of driving. I got back and settled in with some Netflix. My girlfriend had plans to go hang out with her friends, so she was out most of the night. I thought I'd finally get a reprieve from all that spooky stuff. And that's when my cat and dog both started tracking something around my apartment. The way their heads were moving, whatever they were tracking was fast. I've seen them track bugs and stuff before, but neither of them focused on it this much. My dog started growling, and whatever it was seemed to move into the corner of the room. My cat Anna jumped right next to me on the couch, while Poppy, my dog, growled at the corner. He slowly started to back up toward me. After a full week of crap like this, I wasn't even that scared anymore. I was just angry and tired. Whatever this thing was, it certainly liked to keep me from falling asleep, always making my cat and dog freak out in the night. I remember one time they tracked the thing suddenly moving out of the corner towards us. My dog started barking like crazy. After I got her to stop, I heard a growl return to us from the center of the room. I desperately said for whatever this was to please just leave me alone. I got a huge wave of chills and got goosebumps in places I didn't even know I could get them. About 2 minutes later, my dog started barking again, and my cat was on full alert. All I could do at this point was just give up and hope that whatever it was would leave me alone. At this point, I had just begun to put my earbuds in and try to block out the eerie sounds of knocking on walls and stuff. I'd watch YouTube. This time, I decided to stay up until my girlfriend got back and let her know what was happening. Whatever it was took this as an opportunity to mess with me. I was laying on the couch and kept feeling something touching me every 5 minutes. After this went on for a while, I just tried to ignore it. I learned that whatever this was got worse if I tried to engage with it. The second my girlfriend got home, she walked through the door, and I could tell whatever it was just dissipated. The uneasy feeling was gone, and there were no more weird noises. I had a restful night with her there. I don't know if whatever this is gone for good or will come back later, but I'll post an update if anything happens. Two years ago, I took my wife, my father, and my son, who was then 3, to visit family in rural New England. They live on a small farm, with buildings that date back to the 1700s. They've been restored and modernized, of course, and a guest house was built about 20 years ago. My cousin is a prolific photographer, and my auntie had decorated most of the rooms in the main house and guest house with her photos. We didn't notice much about the photos in the guest house when we first arrived, probably because we were all jet-lagged. The next morning, after a sound night's sleep, we were sitting in the main family room eating breakfast and making plans for the day, when I noticed that my son was keeping his head down and not answering my father whenever he spoke to him. This was unusual, because even at that young age, they were very close. I looked over at my dad and noticed he was sitting in front of a photo. It was of a room in a run-down house. The room had a large window with sunlight streaming in, casting shadows across the length of the room towards a dark corner. I got an incredibly uneasy feeling from this photo, but I didn't really think much more of it. We finished breakfast and all got up from the table, and I noticed that my son was walking in a wide arc around the end of it, where my father had been sitting. Again, this was quite strange. I dismissed it as a weird 3-year-old thing. Over the next day or so, I noticed him becoming more and more uneasy any time we were at the dining table and doing whatever he could to avoid looking at that photo. I decided to ask him what was wrong, and he answered me very matter-of-factly. "The bad man in the picture is looking at me. He's not nice." I looked back at the picture and got chills down my spine. There was no man in the picture itself, but I got a feeling there was more to the story than that, than just an empty room. I decided to ask my cousin about the picture, and she told me it was taken at an abandoned farm a bit further upstate. It was one of her favorite pictures, but had always given my aunt the creeps, so it was moved to the guest house. Over the next couple of days, whenever I would ask my son about it, he would say things like, "The bad man is looking at me. He doesn't like me. He wants to hurt me." I didn't really think much of it until we were going to bed one night. All of a sudden, my son was launched into the air and fell for seemingly no reason, right in the middle of the hall. He started crying hysterically. When I asked him if he was okay, he said the bad man had hurt him, right on his leg. I checked his leg, and sure enough, right on the side there was a large bruise that looked like he had been struck with a blunt object or someone's foot. I didn't want to play into his fears, but I asked him how the bad man could hurt him if he was in the photo downstairs. His answer was enough for me to pack up all our stuff and move to the main house with my aunt, uncle, and cousins right away. "He's not down there. He comes up here when we go to bed." We left soon after, so I never found out anything more about the farm where the photo was taken. I'm sure there was some kind of evil presence around it, though. Has anyone experienced something similar? Please share if you have. When I was a child, I grew up pretty sporty and picked up basketball when I was around 7. I played it often, and eventually, when I was about 9, I had joined a state club where we would play weekly games. Once a year, there was a state championship. It was at one of these events that this story takes place. The championships were held over one weekend in one massive basketball stadium. It was Saturday, and I was 10 years old. I had played a couple of games that day, and in between games, my dad and I were at the main court, watching another. I remember seeing a young boy on the court who had fallen over. No one really paid attention to him since a lot of people were knocked over and injured during the many games. People only started to speak loudly and crowd around him when they noticed he wasn't moving. I heard screams, and one of my friend's moms, who was a nurse, went over to him. I remember her calling over people, checking for a pulse and trying to wake him up. And that's when someone brought out a defibrillator. Seeing it used on someone at such a young age scared me to tears. They continued performing CPR and trying to resuscitate him. Announcements came over the loudspeakers, demanding everyone leave the court. My dad and I finally got up and left. He later told me he had fully frozen up, and I felt the same. While exiting the room, I then saw an ambulance coming through the front doors with a stretcher. I saw his lifeless body being wheeled away. I remember the rest of my basketball team was confused as to what the hell was going on, unable to grasp the situation. All I could do was sit outside and cry in my dad's arms. The rest of the day sucked even more than ever. I was supposed to attend a wedding, and I still ended up going. My well-meaning but overbearing family kept crowding around me and asking if I was okay. All I wanted was to be left alone. A couple of years later, I was diagnosed with anxiety, which I've been able to trace back to that event. It really changed my perspective on life. Seeing a perfectly healthy kid get knocked over once and just die altogether. Seeing just how easily and quickly your life can be taken from you. Even now to this day, I can't pass by that stadium. I've been in it once or twice to play more basketball games since, but a couple of weeks ago I unintentionally passed it by, and all those memories flooded into my brain. I broke down. My heart really goes out to that family who lost their kid that day. The memory of it happening so suddenly, and everybody panicking and freaking out, will always be in my mind. When I was 12, I went to a friend's house for the day. This was in the UK. My friend's parents were very rich and had this mansion-type place way out in the countryside. Northern Wales, by the way. She had 6 siblings, and her parents were hippie artist types who just let the kids run wild. We basically never saw them the whole day. Anyway, we were really into acting, so we decided to practice the play we were in our drama group. We went into what was a ballroom of some sort, a really massive room. Hardly any furniture, loads of paintings, big windows, and French doors. As she was doing her thing and I was watching, I saw a shadow person walk into the room through the big folding doors behind her. The person walked sideways, almost like a crab, and they were sidling right towards me. She seemed to notice nothing at all, and was acting her socks off whilst this thing was approaching me from across the room. It appeared to be male, quite tall, and moving in a way as if it didn't want to be noticed, like I might not see it somehow if it was going sideways. Well, obviously I did. I sat there with this thing getting closer and closer until I jumped up and ran towards my friend, yelling that we needed to get out right now. We did, and to my surprise, all that she told me after was, "Oh, that thing? Yeah, people see it all the time. We just kinda ignore it." All I could think was, what the fuck? I was so annoyed. I wanted to discuss it, to deal with it in some way. But she acted like nothing was out of the ordinary with this at all. Looking back, there's a chance that maybe she was scared too, and didn't want to acknowledge it more by discussing it. Whatever it was definitely there, and I got an ominous feeling of foreboding from it. I had a random guy become obsessed with me, and now he's dead. Here's the story behind that. I was 17 and had just gotten out of the shower. I was sat in my bed ready to fall asleep when I heard a voice coming from just outside my bedroom window. They shouted something super loud, but I couldn't make out what exactly they were saying. There was a crack in the blinds from when my cat had laid on them, so I peeked out, but I couldn't see anyone there. I really thought I was tripping out because I lived in a relatively safe suburb. I took some Benadryl and went to bed. The next day, I woke up to find someone pounding on my front door so hard, it was like he was trying to break it off at its hinges. My mom screamed and scared the guy off with police threats, and I taped garbage bags over my windows. We told our neighbors as well. It took us 3 months to discover his license plates so we could file a PO, which was all we could really do. During this time period, he made a habit of leaving upside-down buckets underneath my bedroom window on occasion to let me know he was still around and watching me. I've held on to his name ever since learning it from the police report, and after some Facebook sleuthing, I learned he actually died during last year, which is the only reason he stopped harassing me. I'm a woman, and this happened when I was 19. At the job I had during that time, I used to work some really late nights. I no longer work there, but I do miss it sometimes. Honestly, it was kind of fun. I also did have one scary experience while working there, though. It happened one Thursday night, after a particularly late shift. I think I got off at about midnight or so, and I was driving back really late. The drive back home usually took about 15 minutes, and I lived with my parents at this time. Several minutes into the drive, I was on a sort of quiet road when my car just started smoking out of nowhere. I had no idea what was going on, so I pulled over to the side of the road and turned it off. Basically right when my car stopped though, I noticed a truck pulling over behind me. The road was mostly quiet, but this pickup truck, I guess, had been driving behind me and I hadn't noticed. Maybe he saw the smoke and wanted to see if I was okay. I was in my car with it stopped, and immediately I saw the driver's door to the truck open behind me. I saw a man get out and start walking toward me. He was a much bigger guy who looked to be slightly older than I was. I opened my door and got out and said hi to the man. He was very friendly right away and said that he had noticed my car smoking and asked what happened. I said that I didn't know, and I wasn't much of a car person really. I remember him saying that I couldn't drive it like that, and he asked me where I was going. He then offered to give me a ride to my parents' house. I accepted his offer. I know that wasn't the smartest of me. I didn't know this guy at all, but he was very friendly to me, and I didn't think anything bad could happen to me. I was young and felt invincible, and so I made a bad choice. Anyway, I got into his truck on the passenger side, and he climbed into the driver's side seat. It was a pretty big truck. Right away when I got in, he started talking to me and remained very friendly. He asked me where I was coming from, and then asked me about my job and random things like that. As he was driving, I was basically just answering his 21 questions and talking to him. Before I knew it, we were 10 minutes into the drive. I had told him my address and where I lived, and right away he'd said, "Oh, I know exactly where that is." I remember noticing that he didn't turn where he was initially supposed to. When I pointed that out, he just said, "Oh, I gotta stop somewhere real quick. You don't mind, do you?" I didn't know what else to respond with, so I just said okay. What I should have said is, "What do you mean you have to stop somewhere? It's after midnight, and we're driving in the middle of nowhere. What could you possibly have to do?" I did at least start to get suspicious. During a break in the conversation, I started to take out my phone. I knew my parents were probably asleep, but I wanted to try and call them and let them know what was going on. I didn't work the next day, so we would be able to go down and get the car. But right when I took out my phone, the man driving interrupted me. "What are you doing there?" I started to say I was going to text my mom, but he interrupted me again. He asked what kind of phone I had. He then said some nonsense like he was planning to buy the same one, and asked me to show it to him. As I held it up, he snatched it out of my hand, then opened his window and tossed it out. I was shocked. I yelled at him and asked what the hell he was doing, but obviously he didn't answer me. That's when everything changed. I knew I was really in trouble now. We drove in silence for the next few minutes. I was too scared to really say anything. I had no idea where we were even driving to anymore. We were just turning down random country roads. At least that's what it looked like. After I'm not even sure how long, he finally drove down an especially quiet road and came to a stop on it. We were at the end of this really long driveway that looked like it was going out deep into the woods. After stopping the truck, he told me to get out. As he got out on his side, I got out and he quickly returned to my side. He reached me and grabbed my arm and started to lead me up the driveway. He was much bigger than I was, so I didn't think I would be able to fight him or anything. When we started to walk though, I turned and kicked him in the nuts as hard as I could. He let go of me and dropped to his knees, and I took off running. I don't think he was able to get up and chase after me right away. I had no clue as to where I could be, but when I crossed the street, I ran out into the woods. I knew that I had to take advantage of this moment and didn't stop running. When I made it through this patch of woods, I found myself on another random deserted road. I started running alongside this road, but soon I saw headlights up ahead. There was a car driving. I went out into the middle of the road and started waving my arms like crazy. I didn't care who was driving the car. The odds are they couldn't be as bad as the guy I just escaped from. As the car approached me, I saw red and blue lights start to flash on it. Just my luck, it was actually a police vehicle. I felt 10 times better instantly. They stopped and I told the officer what happened. He called for backup, and when I showed him back to the guy in the truck's driveway, the guy was already long gone. The kind officer drove me back home and asked me several more questions to follow up. Long story short, to my surprise, they did actually find the guy who had picked me up. That was by far the scariest experience of my life. This is a very strange and mysterious story that I heard from my grandfather. He told me that he experienced all of this firsthand. My grandpa grew up in the mountains. All around his family home, there are forests as far as the eye can see. I remember being out there as a child myself, and the trees seemed to tower over everything. Since he grew up in the mountains, he worked in the mountains as well, and he spent a lot of his working life outdoors. As you can imagine, he has more stories than the one I'm about to share with you. This one stuck with me the most, though. I think it's the creepiest, and I don't know how I'd react if it happened to me. Anyways, it happens like this. One day, he was out in the mountains working, and he said he heard this incredibly unusual noise. It sounded like a very low, croaky and crow-like call. I can imagine what that sounds like, and I hope you can too. After that weird low crow sound, he said he felt a presence. He turned to face whatever this was. It was at that point he saw a crow approaching him. It hopped a couple of steps and then repeated. It didn't seem to be frightened of my grandpa. and unlike most birds, actually headed towards him rather than fleeing away from him. It slowly approached and stopped just before his feet. At that point, my grandfather remembered words the locals had shared as gossip about these strange encounters in the woods. They told him not to observe, provoke, or ignore their presence. I found the vagueness of that statement pretty chilling. I guess the underlying tone was that whatever you saw out there in the forest, you better not pay it any attention. You must shut your eyes and make sure not to move a muscle. You just have to wait until whatever you see goes away and has moved on. My grandfather says he experienced the approaching of these crows on a number of occasions, usually when he was working deep in the mountains. He would always follow the local rules, but over time he developed a sense of curiosity about what might happen if he did not do so. He wondered if perhaps it was just a normal crow, and it was a bunch of superstitions from a bygone era. He thought of how legends from times gone by would go on to be disproved in the modern age. It was probably nothing more than a local superstition. One day, my grandfather decided to acknowledge the bird right in front of him. He said he opened his eyes to see a pitch-black, shadowy void in front of him, the outline of a human figure. It was nothing but darkness. He could see everything clearly that morning, but through this shaped patch, there was nothing but a void, a chilling sense of nothingness. I can kind of imagine it looked like a black hole or something. He said he was so disturbed by this sight that he couldn't move. He had a sudden realization he was seeing something he couldn't or shouldn't be seeing. He closed his eyes, and then, as if there was a snap, his vision returned to him, and he was back in the woods beneath the morning rays of the sun, the ominous presence having vanished altogether. He was grateful to be back to normal, but he said for about a month after that strange encounter, he was in a state of living hell. He would regularly wake up from fever dreams to see a towering shadowy figure entering his bedroom or standing above him glaring at him every night. The same nightmare played out over and over, and it made him terrified of sleep. He would also experience frequent bouts of sleep paralysis, waking up and seeing this entity. He struggled with his mental state deeply, unable at points to realize if it was day, night, a dream, or reality. Just when he was reaching his wit's end, the encounters with these shadowy beings gradually ended. After he told me about his experience, he laughed and said to make sure I follow the local rules when I'm out in the woods. My grandma also told me about a similar experience. She said there was no crow in hers, just a shadowy form approaching her. She froze and shut her eyes, and eventually it went away. It's unclear to me if these entities are one and the same, but one thing is clear: there are some things out there that we just cannot comprehend. A few months ago, my friend and I went to hike Pikes Peak near Colorado Springs. The hike up this mountain is literally a marathon with about 7,000 feet of vertical gain. The general rule of thumb is that if you're not up and back down below the tree line by noon, you're at risk of being struck by lightning. We made the decision to hike the whole thing in one day by starting at 11 p.m. the night before. We had rolled up to the trailhead at 10:30, only to find the parking lot completely empty. That felt very odd for a trailhead on a Friday night in late summer. I had done nighttime hikes of other mountains, but the parking lot was usually at least half full at all times, especially in this season. In Colorado, people love hiking. That made me feel a little uneasy, but I shrugged it off. We started the hike and started off at a pretty good pace, getting about 5 miles in within the first few hours. It was about 1 a.m. at this point. We were walking down a narrow part of the trail that had a large rock cropping out to the right of us. As we passed by it, we began to hear a scraping noise, followed by some rustling of bushes, then silence. That freaked me out a bit, but I told myself it was just a deer, and we must have spooked it. We continued along for the next few miles and kept hearing these strange noises off in the distance. They were always to our right. About an hour later, at about 2 a.m., we had just passed camp, which is about 7 miles from the trailhead, still without seeing any other human being other than my friend. Even the campsite itself was deserted. Anyway, I was walking along the trail about 2 to 3 meters ahead of my friend when I looked up a little and saw 2 glowing white circles floating in the darkness on the trail. It was about 15 meters ahead of me. My heart sunk, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My friend asked me why I had stopped, and I told him to point his headlamp, which was brighter than mine, up the trail. We saw that the 2 glowing orbs belonged to a mountain lion. At this point, I was just frozen, looking at him and thinking, crap, that's the last thing I want to see out here. The lion was quite aware of our presence as well, and stared at us for about 15 seconds. It retreated into the darkness behind some trees, and we could hear it circling us. At this point, without saying a word, I took out a can of bear mace and handed it to my friend. We turned around on the spot and began hiking back down the mountain at a very brisk pace. I was looking right down the trail. My friend spent about 80% of the time walking back to back with me, so it wouldn't jump out and surprise us. We made it back down the trailhead at about 3:30 and counted our blessings. We went home. Overall, the hike was very unsettling, being deep in the forest without coming across any other people, especially when you would expect to meet others. It's very uncomfortable and unsettling, let alone being stalked by one of the most dangerous predators in North America. I know that mountain lions don't often take the opportunity to attack humans, but I've been told if you see a mountain lion and they've been aware of your presence for a good while prior to that, it's usually a warning sign. I can only assume that all the noises I heard that night were from the mountain lion stalking us. Also, the next day we found out why we were alone on the trail. Apparently, someone had gotten attacked and died, so the trail was closed. But we missed the memo since we got up there so late. One morning a couple of years ago, I was going to leave for work. I worked a pretty typical office job, and I live in a house just outside of the city. I went out to my car that was in my detached garage. When I got inside and tried starting the engine though, it wouldn't start at all. This was strange because my car had been running perfectly fine up until this point. It wasn't even that old, and it ran perfectly well the day before. I didn't have time to look and see what exactly was wrong. I had to be at work pretty soon. I took out my phone and called a Lyft. Luckily, I lived close enough to the city that I could pretty easily find one, and they got me to work on time. After getting to work, the day went pretty normal. Of course, I had to take another Lyft back from the office to my home, and when I got back, I decided to see my car. I was going to check and try and see if I could figure out what was wrong, then bring it to the shop. When I got into my garage and popped open the hood, I took a look at the engine and could see it was all messed up. Now, I'm not a mechanic or anything, but I could immediately tell my engine had been tampered with. I didn't know who would do this though, why or even how they'd gotten into my garage. I was really frustrated. I was standing there in my garage trying to figure out how this could have happened. I was looking around when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I looked down underneath some shelves in my garage, and I saw a man I'd never seen before hiding there. He'd been staring at me the entire time. When I noticed him, he instantly reacted, realizing he was caught. My only reaction was to move away. When he stood up, I noticed he was holding a hammer in his hands. That's when I knew I needed to leave right now. I ran out of my garage and around to my house. I got inside and locked the door behind me. The man reached the door 10 seconds later and tried entering behind me. When he realized the door was locked, he started banging on the window with the hammer. I got out my phone and hit 911, then ran to the back side of my house. It didn't take long before I heard glass breaking. This man had to be insane. I heard a bunch of noise by the front door as I was talking to the police at the back side of my house. Soon I could tell the man had made it inside. At that point, I quickly fled out the back door and ran out of my backyard into my neighbor's. I then made my way to the street. I just wanted to get away from that guy. I no longer saw or heard him behind me. I told the police to hurry up, and then I walked around the street, looking out for the man. I walked around for probably close to 10 minutes, but I couldn't see the man anywhere. I noticed the police were arriving, so I went back over and met up with them. They entered my house through the now wide-open front door. I remained outside with other officers for several minutes. Soon, they emerged with the man that had broken in. He was arrested. I think he must have been on drugs or something. The guy seemed totally crazy. When I went back inside my house, I saw he had smashed up a bunch of stuff. He must have taken the hammer to everything he could reach. I'm just glad he didn't get the opportunity to take it to me. Luckily, I had insurance and didn't have to pay a whole lot for the repairs. Unfortunately, it still took a while to get everything fixed that the man had broken. I don't know how or why, but somehow he managed to get into my garage. He tampered with my car and must have been hiding in there all day, including when I tried to start my vehicle in the morning. It was only when I noticed him that he tried to kill me. I'm really glad the man was caught and arrested. When I was in college, I lived on campus. During longer holidays, though, I commuted from my hometown to the city I was studying in, which was a journey of about 5 to 6 hours. I used to choose the one at midnight, as it meant I could spend an extra day at home, travel overnight, and arrive in time for my classes in the morning. One particular time, I was taking a nap in my bus seat, when suddenly I felt something brush against my skin on my waist. I ignored it, but I felt something graze the whole length of my thigh. An alarm bell started ringing in my head, and I woke up. I noticed a man, probably in his 50s, sitting in the seat next to mine. He was smiling very creepily at me. At the time, I thought I had just imagined the touch, so I didn't call the man out immediately. He had a very sweet and gentle-sounding voice and started talking to me very softly. He started out asking my name and why I was traveling to the city, went on to ask me a few more questions. I answered all of his questions vaguely as possible. I don't know why, but then he proceeded to hand me a piece of paper with his phone number written on it and asked me to call him again if I was ever on this bus. My 19-year-old self took the paper from him and didn't want to confront him. All of a sudden, he leaned over and licked my cheek and told me I smelled really good. Needless to say, I got out of there as fast as possible. That whole encounter was just incredibly creepy. When I was 19, I was at a friend's house one night for a party. His parents were on vacation, like a grown-up home alone. Things were starting to wrap up and it was very late. We were all standing around in the driveway, talking as we got ready to leave. All of a sudden, this beat-up old Ford Bronco stopped in the street outside, and a tall, lanky guy jumped out. He walked right up to our group and just stood there, not saying a single word. He wasn't acting threatening per se. It was just really strange and awkward. At that point, we all decided it would be a good time to leave. We jumped in our cars and he jumped in his Bronco, and we all drove off. As I got onto the street, he pulled out right behind me. I didn't think too much of it at first, but then he revved his engine and pulled up right to my tail. He turned on his high beams and tried to blind me, and that's when I knew something was up. At the time, I was driving a little 1985 Dodge Omni that could do maybe 75 if you dropped it off a cliff. There was no way I was going to outrun a V8 Ford Bronco, even if I was crazy enough to try. I didn't know what the hell to do. In retrospect, I probably should have driven by a police station, but that never occurred to me. I didn't even know where the nearest one was. This was in the early 90s, so no smartphones or Google Maps to help me. The only thing I could think to do was swerve onto a side street into a poorly lit residential neighborhood. The guy followed me, right on my tail, bumping into me several times. At one point during a turn, I had a bit of a head start, so I gunned it down the road and shut off my lights. I sort of randomly turned around different turns in the neighborhood for a while, until I couldn't even remember what route I had taken. I couldn't see the guy in my mirror anymore. When I was really confident I had lost him, I found my way back to a main road and turned my lights back on. At that point, I headed home. To this day, I don't know if I was a victim of a stupid drunken prank or if that guy was really out to get me. Back in August of 1978, I was a teenager with a penchant for hitchhiking between Illinois and Michigan. One time, I caught a ride on Route 94 outside of Chicago. It was with a normal-seeming middle-aged man in a pickup truck. He was a nice enough guy, very friendly and talkative, but an hour and a half or so into the ride, I happened to glance at his crotch and noticed his zipper was wide open. I stayed calm and waited until we got near an exit and asked him nicely to pull over, my excuse being that I was getting car sick. He ignored me and blew right past the exit. There was another exit just a few miles ahead, so I told him I was extremely nauseous and I was going to vomit if he didn't take the next one. He blew past that one too, and I instantly recognized the danger I was in now. I knew I had to get out of this man's truck. I reached into my backpack and pretended to grab something and hold it in my hand. In as tough a voice I could muster, I told him it was in his best interest to drop me off at the side of the highway, and if he didn't, I would use the thing in my hand. That would turn out very badly for both of us. It worked. He must have figured it wouldn't be worth the trouble to hurt me. He took the next exit and dropped me off at a gas station. Fast forward to several months later, when I picked up a newspaper, I saw a picture of the same man who had picked me up hitchhiking. It was on the front page, and he had been arrested in multiple murders of young men. I never hitchhiked again after that. Last week, I was on a 5-hour drive via the M6 here in England. There was a car in front of me, and we ended up driving in a sort of convoy for a few minutes. In the process of overtaking a lorry, though, I overtook him as well. For some reason, he didn't take that very well at all. For the next 10 minutes or so, he kept speeding past me, moving in front and then slowing down repeatedly. Eventually, he pulled up beside me in the middle lane, and as he drove beside me, he maintained speed, making sure he stayed exactly level with my car. I could see the man inside trying to get my attention, but I did my best to ignore him and keep my eyes on the road. When I finally did look, thinking there might have been a good reason for him trying to get my attention, I could see him giving off all kinds of grief. He wasn't trying to help out at all. He was just really mental. Anyway, there was a lorry behind me and a car in front, and this man was pinning me in with his vehicle, getting closer and closer to me. An exit was coming up, and he was pushing me toward the left. I was afraid he would push me into the motorway exit and follow me down roads with only one lane. The lorry behind me put on its brakes, and I did the same, slipping out of the gap between. I slowed down to a bare minimum and managed to lose the car. There have been many heart-pounding things that have happened to me over the years, but that really got me. Just for background information, I was about 10 or 11 during the occurrence of this issue. I was in middle school, and the story has stuck with me ever since. My parents used to usually drop me off at school at an appropriate time. After some time, though, I started walking to and from school by myself. My parents objected to this, of course, but I was a very stubborn child, and I didn't ever listen to their objections. I just continued to walk to school, sometimes even at 6 o'clock in the morning. My school started at 8 o'clock, and it was a fair bit of distance to walk there. This went on for a few months without any problems at all, although I did sometimes feel as if I was being watched. The walk to my school was a very busy route, even at 6 o'clock in the morning. I would always speed up near the darker path under the tunnel, and then walk at a normal rate once I was out of it. At some point, though, the feeling intensified, and I was very confident that I was being watched by someone, and possibly stalked as well. I don't really remember the exact date this happened, but I do remember I woke up and did my usual routine. Went out the door at around 6 o'clock or so, while my parents were still asleep. I had started walking up the hilly and busy road, which connected to the highway. I was still climbing the first hill, and was about to near the top, when I saw a red truck slowly rolling up behind me. Obviously, this captured my attention. The man inside was in his mid-30s or 40s, and he called out to me, "Hey there, you want to ride to school, friend?" I instantly said no and started to walk faster. He caught up easily, and then talked to me again. Come on, are you sure you don't need a ride?" I didn't say no this time. I just started running to a random house. I began banging on the door and yelled out, "Mom! Hey Mom, I'm here!" After I said that, the man sped off immediately. After that, I continued walking to school and sat down to talk with my friends about what happened. They brushed it off, but I knew it was not a matter to be brushed off so simply. At this point, I checked to see if I had brought my school bag with me. I had actually forgotten it at home. I talked with the vice principal about this issue and had to file a report with the police. Later on, I had to talk with a detective with my mother. For some reason, I still continued to walk to school, but at a much more reasonable time. I always made sure to walk back with my friends as well. Whenever I was alone, I was much more aware of my surroundings. It's been about 4 years since then, and I haven't heard anything else about this situation or the man. Hopefully it stays that way. This occurred 3 years ago in the 6th grade, during summer break. It had just started, and my friends and I were looking to go ding-dong ditching. Me and my friends had gone months earlier in the school year, but that resulted in us getting suspended and the police being notified. We were really desperate to start again, though, so it wasn't a surprise when my friend contacted me to have a ding-dong ditching session. We were going to wear our Halloween masks. It was the last day of school before the break, and I was certainly up for it. Now we couldn't get suspended anymore. We all met up after school with our Spider-Man masks, as well as other weird things we could use to hide our faces. We got started instantly. My friend Jose took the first house. He ran up, ignoring the no trespassing sign, and he kicked the door. We all sprinted away, laughing at our prank. To our dismay, nobody opened the door. Jordan took the second house. He ran up and knocked on the screen. There was a loud noise that kind of sounded like glass shattering. We ran away, laughing yet again. However, this time a skinny man of around 30 years old opened the door and saw us running away. He was extremely angry. After seconds of shouting, he slammed the door and then went back inside. I chuckled and said we should do his house again, expecting a big reaction from this guy. I wanted to look brave, so I ran up and kicked the screen, then ran away. This time, though, it was as if he was waiting right behind the door. When I was around 10 feet away, it suddenly swung open, and the man began sprinting after me. He realized he wouldn't be able to catch a fast and skinny 12-year-old kid, though, and jumped into his car. He started it, and my friends and I all began panicking in fear, realizing this guy was going to come after us in his car. I was the fastest out of the group, so I had to lead. We all ran down the hill, where two of my friends lived at. They ran into their houses, leaving the other four of us to keep sprinting, being chased by this man in his car. I kept running even when my lungs felt like they were about to burst. I turned the corner and jumped a fence into a random person's backyard. The rest of my friends also joined me. Jordan talked about calling the police, but we talked him out of it. We would get in major trouble for ding-dong ditching. Anyway, we watched this guy speed past our hiding spot as we breathed sighs of relief. Suddenly, though, he parked his car and began looking around for us. We hid well, and he hadn't spotted us in the bushes. We could even see him stopping and talking to some kids who were trying to walk home, trying to find where we had gone. After taking one last look around, he eventually drove away. Unfortunately, Jordan had to go back the path the man had driven away. He waited a bit and then ran for about 5 seconds. He suddenly turned around and began screaming, though. He was coming back towards us. Apparently, the man had pretended to drive away and parked behind a house, waiting to see when we would come out. Jordan fell for it and started running at full speed. The man began chasing him in his car once more. Honestly, I thought we were going to die. As if summoned by God, though, we noticed a police car parked 50 feet in front of us. We ran towards it, screaming for help. As you can imagine, the man fled after he saw the cop. We told the cop a fake story about how the man had been chasing us in his car when we were just trying to walk home. I don't think we were going to be ding-dong ditching anymore, at least not for a while after. This isn't my experience, but one I heard from a very good friend of mine. I asked him if I could share it, and he told me it was alright. I hope I do it justice, because God, if this happened to me, I don't know how I would be able to sleep ever again. I'll go into the first-person narrative from this point forward, just to make it more simple. It all happened one night while I was out in the mountains. I was set to be staying with some friends that I hadn't seen since school. I had been invited by a childhood friend of mine. Besides him, though, everyone else was basically a stranger to me now. We were set to be staying in a mountain lodge. It looked really nice, a big pure wooden structure, a log cabin essentially. They had all raved about how good the lodge was before, and I was excited to see if it lived up to all the hype. It did, honestly. It was a really nice place. It was in the middle of the mountains, though, pretty rustic. We had plans to go on a hike the following morning, and we were supposed to be getting an early night. We ended up staying up later than I expected, though. I turned off all the lights in the lodge in preparation to turn in for the night, when I began to hear something strange. I heard this weird dome noise at the lodge's door. It wasn't very loud, so it was barely noticeable. We had left the door open just a little to allow some air to flow in. It was a bit weird to me. It sounded like something sharp hitting a tree or something. My friend, who was sort of the leader of our little hiking get-together, was the oldest, so he approached the door and pushed it shut all the way. He locked it and didn't say a word. Neither did anyone else in the cabin. No one seemed to be that bothered by this strange noise, so I figured it wasn't that big a deal either. After that, everyone went to their beds, and we all went to sleep. When the morning came around, I got up to wash my face. It looked like it was going to be a warm morning, so I opened the door to allow some fresh air in. I was a bit curious about that noise I had heard the night before, too. What I saw that morning was pretty freaky, though. As I opened the door and stepped out, I looked behind me and realized there were a bunch of weird fishing hook-like things and various nails sticking out of the door. They had been stabbed into the wood. From each various hook, there was this thick and coarse black thread that trailed off into the distant trees and brush. I couldn't even see where it ended. I stood there completely perplexed by what I was seeing. After a couple of moments, some of the others in the lodge came downstairs and stood by me at the cabin's open door. Something came down from the mountains last night, huh? Maybe there wasn't much prey out there that night. The guys were saying stuff like that when they saw the hooks in the door, and that made me feel really weird. I felt like I was the only one who didn't really know what was going on. They didn't seem that fazed about this strange discovery. I couldn't stand it, though. I had to ask them about these hooks and what they were for. They began telling me a story. The locals said there was a disturbing woman who lived out there deep in the woods. Apparently, she used the hooks I saw to hunt down small animals. "Here, look at this," one of them said, as they pointed at one of the gnarled hooks splintered in the wooden door. He didn't point at the hook itself, though. He pointed at what I thought was a thread. Well, it wasn't thread at all. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was someone's hair, matted, gross human hair that had been woven into this kind of rope-like quality. It was disgusting. Before we left, one of the guys pulled out his machete and pried the hooks out of the door, then cut the thick rope of hair into pieces. We took those fishing hooks with us back down the mountain. I say fishing hooks, but they weren't exactly made of iron. They were more like the splintered bones of animals or something, and sharpened up rocks. We threw them in the garbage at the foot of the mountain. It really freaked me out. It felt like I was the only one who found this strange and unnerving, though. Nothing happened after that. It just seemed as if everyone was fine with this feral person living out there in the mountains killing animals. I decided not to bother hiking the following day. It was all far too weird for me. Has anyone heard of any strange encounters or stories out of Mount Mizugaki in Yamanashi? I had a weird experience there. I climbed it a few years back on August the 4th. I started my climb during the evening, and about halfway through, I was confronted by something very, very strange. By the way, I'm a very experienced mountain climber. I've been climbing mountains like Mizugaki for about 8 years. I've had some very interesting climbs in those years, but nothing quite like this. According to my log data, I started my climb at 4:43 or so. After I started my climb, I reached a waterfall that they had there, and from there I could see the fog or mist. I didn't expect these conditions, but I was pretty confident that I knew my way. The signage was excellent, and all my equipment was in perfect working order. I was well provisioned as well. I had the means to make some shelter if the weather turned for the worst, so I decided to proceed with my climb. This turned out to be a very bad piece of judgment by me. After I had passed the waterfall, I proceeded another 40 minutes or so. I remember the next time I looked at my watch, it was around 7:01 or so. I stopped because it was getting darker, and the fog seemed to be getting thicker. I equipped my heavy-duty headlamp and turned on my flashlight. When I turned on the light, though, I was a little bit shocked to see that there was someone walking up ahead of me in the fog. I could only just about make out their silhouette. I didn't want to hike with some stranger, so I decided to hang back and drop my pace a little. I don't mean to be antisocial per se, I just really like hiking alone. To each their own, right? The fog got thicker and thicker, and it was getting ridiculous for an August climb. I was pretty much relying on the light of the person up ahead to see which direction I should take. You know, twists in the road and such. It felt strange. That night, something was definitely unusual, but I'm a stubborn guy. I probably should have turned back, but I kept on going. I didn't want to lose to the mountain, if that made sense. Even if I slowed my pace right down, I noticed that the distance between me and the other climber never seemed to change at all. It was constant, and that went for the light up ahead of me as well. I noticed something about that light at that point, though. It seemed to be off-color. Usually hikers and mountain climbers carry these strong LED lights which really cut through the darkness. The person up ahead of me had this weird orange-yellow light that seemed a little odd for the conditions. Whoever was in front of me looked back now and then as well. I would have expected the light of an LED torch to blind me when he did, but the light barely fazed me. I checked my watch again and saw it was sometime after 9 o'clock or so. I didn't feel as if there was any sign of the summit up ahead. Since that person in front of me was looking back so often, I could make the judgment that things might be getting a little tricky. I was finding it harder and harder to find my way. I took my time to stop and check my GPS positioning against the map I had brought with me. I couldn't really get a good signal on my GPS system, though. I didn't panic because I knew that fog could sometimes interfere with its functions. I got out my altimeter, which is a tool that can be used to predict the altitude. It also helps with directions of slopes and the like. The altitude I was at 1,870 meters, and the slope direction was due west. In other words, I had managed to veer off the beaten path quite considerably. I was supposed to be directly east of the mountain's peak, but I was nowhere near. Served me right after following the other hiker up ahead of me. I should have just turned back. I was annoyed at myself, but the worst thing I could do at this point was to try and find my way back on my own, especially when you consider this dense fog. I planned on hunkering down right where I was until the morning light came, in hopes the fog would have cleared up a little by then. I began preparations for shelter from the night. I was preparing my little camping area. I thought the other guy had moved ahead, but I saw the light from the other hiker flickering just off in the distance. What a strange guy, I thought to myself. My hands got to work. I guess the light could have been some reflection off the fog from someplace else. I didn't really give it much thought. I pitched up my little tent and then made some food. After that, I got some sleep. I woke up a little bit later, when I thought it was getting brighter out. I fully opened my eyes, but there was nothing but darkness all around me. I realized that the light shining at me that had woken me up was not the morning light at all. It must have been the light of the other hiker. What the hell was this guy doing, I wondered. Why was he lingering so close to my camp? I guess he didn't want to be on his own, but if I'm perfectly honest, the presence of this stranger being so close to me was starting to get a little scary. I say he, but I guess it could have easily been a woman as well. It was hard to tell from just their silhouette. For some reason, this complete stranger wanted to stick close to me. Pretty weird if you ask me. And the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. I wanted to get away from this guy. I picked up my stuff and knew for a fact that if I headed down the mountain in a southwesterly direction, I would eventually reach a small wooden lodge hiker used to escape the elements. Sure, I would be undoing some of the great work I had done by climbing that far, but I felt as if it was worth it to get away from this stranger. I grabbed my compass and my altimeter, and it was pretty fine. I think the best way to describe myself back in those days was physically strong, but not mentally strong. I had proved to myself that I wasn't in the right space for a crazy solo climb. I looked at my watch again, and it was now past 1 o'clock in the morning, way too late to be trying to find my way in the darkness. As I looked down at my watch, though, I heard a woman's voice call out to me, clear and very close. "Where are you going? That's not the right way." I spun around and looked frantically all over for the owner of that voice. My spine turned to ice as my headlamp revealed no one around me. There were just rows and rows of empty trees and thick rolling fog. The light I had seen earlier was no longer visible, making it even harder to see. I started to run in a panic. I was freaking out. I didn't know where the voice had come from, and it really scared me. I ended up out of breath. I saw the light from earlier was now back, shining through the trees from a southwest direction. In other words, the direction I was heading in. This shouldn't be possible. I had been running down a pathless section of the mountain. There was no way that person with the light could have appeared in front of me when they'd just been behind me. I was scared, but there wasn't much I could do. I wanted to get to the safety of that emergency hut. I hurried down the mountain. I was so nervous that something was going to happen as I got closer to the light. I couldn't help but feel a little in danger. I think the thick fog and darkness had forced me to lose my composure. The voice I'd heard earlier seemed to be coming from all directions somehow. As I ran, the woman's voice kept speaking to me. "Don't go that way. Something bad will happen if you go that way." It was like I was surrounded by something, or whoever it was echoing in my head. The light was disappearing and reappearing again in different locations. This all went on until about 4 o'clock in the morning. I was feeling a bit dizzy, probably due to fear. I realized I was standing on something, so I looked down and saw I'd stepped on a bouquet of flowers apparently. As soon as I stepped on them, all the lights and voices abruptly stopped. There was a strong smell of burning incense for a moment, and then all was gone. I noticed it was starting to get brighter, and the fog was beginning to clear too. I quickly pulled out my GPS system again and made a plan of how to get to the emergency shelter. As I started to move, I think I surprised an old man who'd been sitting there, because he called out to me, "Hey, you okay?" I didn't know if it was the adrenaline or what, but I decided to tell him everything. He told me a couple of things about Mount Mizugaki that I found pretty creepy and pretty interesting. The man said the locals believe that strange mist is connected to another world. It's the belief of the locals that this mist is responsible for several missing persons cases. I asked if someone had gone missing recently, and if that was why there was a bouquet of flowers near the emergency shelter. He said he didn't think there had been any recent reports, or any deaths or anything. I asked if people still brought flowers to the mountains in their memory, and he said no one had gone missing in a long time, so he didn't think so. I don't know if any of this was true or false, though. It was at that point that I realized that I didn't think I had just heard one voice out there in the fog. I'd heard an abundance of voices. They were all women, too. The old men said that the missing person cases were exclusively female. I remember that at times during that wild period where I was running around like a maniac, I could occasionally hear a shriek or screaming in the distance. Something definitely happened out in those mountains if you ask me, but I have no idea why it was revealed to me in such a way. I always wondered why this happened to me. It's one of the most frightening experiences I've ever had in my life. As I'm sure some of you are aware, the hunting season for white-tailed deer is about to start this weekend. I'm a 25-year-old woman, and have been spending a decent chunk of time in the stand with my partner, and in most ventures generally. We discovered that hogs had been rooting up the oats and generally causing havoc, and scaring away the deer from the feeder. We'd gone out a handful of times in the last 2 weeks, attempting to catch this miscreant hog. So far, no luck. It's been very frustrating. At any rate, because of the hogs, I've been spending more time in a stand after dark than I ever have in my entire life. We've been up there from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m., 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., 9 p.m. to 11 p.m., and various other weird time slots. I mention this just in case it's relevant or helps to paint a better picture. There have been a few things that have happened that I've struggled to explain away or rationalize, and my partner is out of ideas too. The first thing happened about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago perhaps. It was around 1 or 2 in the morning, with a decent chunk of moonlight illuminating the area. I was only half paying attention to my surroundings, because I'd already written the night off as a bust. All of a sudden, though, I became aware of a weird whirring or flapping sound. It sounded like it was originating somewhat behind me. My partner said he heard it coming from away to the front left of us, though. At any rate, it was loud, airborne, and passing quickly over us. I'm very familiar with the sounds that drones make, and it wasn't that. It also wasn't a helicopter either. The sound was too small, if that makes sense. It wasn't a bird or some sort of animal. It just sounded way too mechanical. It was flying very low, probably just above the tree line. We couldn't see anything, and couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. The second thing happened about a week ago. We weren't in the stand, but it was still weird and out of the norm. We live on the same property the stand is on. It was around 9 or 10 o'clock at night, when all of a sudden there was a distant boom like an explosion, which hit our home with a very loud thud and shockwave. If you've ever spent any time around heavy artillery or explosives, you'll know what I mean. It was strong enough that my sister-in-law, who lives down the road, called us asking what the hell just happened. It could have been a natural gas explosion. But the weirdest part is that my partner did some digging, and a local emergency management website had posted asking for any info on a similarly unknown explosion back in 2016. We still had no clue what was going on. Then the last incident. Tonight we were out in the stand once again, and it had gotten cold and we'd had tons of rain all day. Everything was damp and dripping wet. We went out at around 10, and it was around 10:30 or so. I was preoccupied with trying to keep my fingers and toes warm when I suddenly became aware of a strange murmuring. My partner heard it as well. It sounded to me like muffled voices off in the distance, several people having a conversation, but just slightly too far out to make out any individual words. The direction the sounds were coming from, though, didn't have any buildings or dwellings for miles. It was just woods. I could make out several different people. They carried on for about 30 seconds and appeared to be having some sort of fierce argument. Then it died off and faded away completely. It all was very eerie, especially with the general gut feeling I'd been having whenever I was out in the dark alone. I keep feeling that I'm being watched by someone and observed in a way. I have very good instincts and try to listen to them. I'd love to know what you all think. There may be a rational explanation for all these phenomenon. All I know is I don't want to be another hunter with a very creepy story, but I feel like I'm starting to see a bell curve emerge. My dad moved into a house in the middle of the woods about 2 years ago, and I moved in with him soon after to help him get around and take care of it and whatnot. On a side note, it's an old house on land that Native Americans heavily inhabited in the South. Honestly, this house is really weird. I remember the first night I spent there, I was woken up by the sound of a woman whispering, "Is anyone home?" It sounded like it was right next to me. My dad didn't believe me when I told him the next day. It's taken a while to get used to living in the deep woods, but something about this property is very weird. There's been more than a few times where I've actually felt a heavy presence, almost like someone is standing right behind me. I have a cat who's very alert to his surroundings and always reacts when someone's approaching my room, and there's been times when he's alerted me, but there was nobody there. Other times he just stares at the corner of my room with an expression that tells me he can see something and I can't. There's been more times than I can count where I'll be leaving a room and suddenly a cabinet will slam or something will move behind me. It sounds silly, but it was odd enough for me to take notice of it. I mentioned this to my father as well, but he just brushed me off. That is, until early this morning, when he woke up and went downstairs to find the basement flooded somehow. The shower in the basement had been turned on, and the drain had been clogged up. Neither of us used that shower down there, though. He's now fully convinced there's a ghost of some kind in this house. I don't know. If you ask me, I think it's more than just the house area. I get that feeling even when I'm out on a hike. Sometimes I leave food scraps and leftovers out in the tree line for animals, and when I come back, I'll find little treasures in the same spot, almost like I've made a trade with someone. I remember I left some leftovers out one time, and the next day in that same spot I found a stone with some sigils carved into it. Another time I found an arrowhead carved out of stone as well. It's all just very strange, so I figured I'd share it here. Years ago, I had a coworker who I got to know in an acquaintance sort of way. She was married, and I had met her husband several times. He was nice-looking and older than her. He was very friendly as well. One day, on her lunch break, she had told me she was going to pick up some pictures from a local pharmacy. This was back in the 90s, when you still had to get pictures developed. When she had returned from lunch, she was very upset. Apparently, they refused to print the pictures. She said it was because they were naked pictures of both her and her husband. She then revealed some very personal details about the two of them that seemed to suggest the husband was sexual in a way I'd never even heard of. I was really young at the time, so I was shocked at the weirdness to be bringing this up to me at all. I was very inexperienced with this sort of thing. All of a sudden, she began telling me that her sister had been raped and murdered several years prior. She said her family had thought her husband had committed the crime. The sister had 2 children, one a baby. The older child had been knocked out, but was able to remember the killer had hid his face, suggesting it was someone the child knew well. My coworker was a strong supporter of the husband and said the family just didn't like him. I didn't know what to think, so I just sort of listened to her and let it go out the other ear. Well, several years later, the husband was arrested, charged and convicted of the rape and murder of the sister. DNA testing had actually advanced enough to test some of the evidence left at the scene. This case was also actually a Forensic Files episode. Long story short, the husband died in prison of cancer. Apparently, my coworker still supported him even after his conviction. I was young, 18 years old, and working my first ever job that I still work to this day. I was assigned to the night shift in a not-so-great area in a relatively nice city on the West Coast. The night was pretty much like any other until I was walking back inside my work building. I was approached by a man who was talking to himself under his breath and had both hands shoved in his pockets. I told the man to maintain a safe distance from me as he moved in very close. I lightly pushed on his chest and took a step back to get him away from me. He took a step forward and mumbled a few other things under his breath. I attempted to step back once more and asked him to please not get so close to my person. He just continued to move closer and closer to me. Before I knew what to do next, he pulled out a very dirty-looking kitchen knife out of his right pocket and held it to the left side of my neck. I put my hands halfway up so he could see them, and I tried to tell him to calm down and run off. I even said that I wouldn't contact the police or tell anyone if he were just to leave and never come back. He became furious, completely enraged, and mumbled a few more things I still couldn't make out. I could feel his knife being pressed harder into my neck, and his eyes started opening wider and wider. I realized I needed to do something fast, or else I might not be making it out of this situation. The second I noticed he didn't have his eyes directly on me, I very slightly but quickly moved my head to the right and pulled back as far as I could. With my right hand, I grabbed his knife hand and tried to get the strongest grip over it I could. I hit his elbow and then pushed my chest and arms toward the direction of his body, trying to push as much of my body weight as I could into this guy. We started to struggle. While we were doing this, somehow the knife ended up too close in the direction of his body, and he stuck the knife into his own neck, causing him to drop to the ground almost immediately. While he was on the ground, I ran inside to dial 911 to get both the police and paramedics on the scene as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the guy had already died by the time I ran back outside. It was before the paramedics even arrived on scene. The police showed up and instantly put me in cuffs and searched my person. I was put into the back of the squad car and told to stay quiet until asked to give my side of the story. I sat in the back of the car for around an hour as I waited for my boss to show up. She showed the officers the cameras, and I was released out of custody. I gave my story to the detectives. Turned out the guy was high on meth and wandering around the streets with a random knife in his pocket. I really thanked the martial arts classes I had taken in my late teens, as well as my ability to let the adrenaline kick in and do its job. I still think about it every day, and I feel oddly bad about the whole thing. I know that taking another man's life was unavoidable in that situation, but sometimes I get angry with myself that I wasn't able to calm him down just a bit more with my words. On the flip side, though, I find myself feeling exactly the same as I did day to day before I ever killed that man at all. I worked at Walmart several years ago. I remember one time, a coworker's ex-husband came in with a gun. He owned a failing business and had committed insurance fraud 3 times. The wife said she had no idea he was committing arson and filed for divorce. The ex-husband was angry at her for daring to testify against him. He asked her why she wouldn't talk to him, and she asked him to leave. He told her he had the gun on him, and for some reason she ran into the woman's restroom at the front of the store to hide. He followed her there and shoved her down. She was on her back, while he climbed on top of her, straddling her. He was crying and saying that his life was over. Another person happened to be in the bathroom, but he let her go unharmed. They evacuated the entire store, while the cops set up outside. The cops finally said they were coming in just to talk to the man. He started shooting at the cops and missed them. The bullet went through the door. He said he knew he was going away for the rest of his life for shooting at a cop and said he was sorry and that he loved his wife. He then shot himself in the head while still on top of her. They had to move his body off of her to help get her up and out. She wasn't harmed physically, but she still goes to therapy to this day. We were pretty good friends at the time, and it scares me because I would have never thought her husband was capable of any of that. I was helping direct traffic at an event in a Walmart parking lot when I started to hear a man shouting about 25 to 50 feet away from me. I couldn't really tell what was going on, so I kept directing traffic for a few more minutes until I realized his family had locked themselves in the car, seemingly in fear of this man. He was intoxicated, cussing and screaming, not only scaring them, but the hundreds of people and families walking through the parking lot as well. I calmly approached the man and told him I understood he must be going through a stressful situation. I asked him if I could help to resolve things in any way. He looked at me with fire in his eyes and told me I'd better not get in between him and his family. I tried to reassure him that it wasn't my intention. I tried to calm him down. I just wanted to help things de-escalate verbally. I was able to guide him about 20 feet away from the family in the car. While we were talking, the wife/girlfriend saw this as her opportunity to drive away. Before she could, though, he jumped on the hood of the moving car. I had no time to think. I jumped in front of the car. My thoughts were of her plowing over families in her panic while driving with him on the hood. They flashed into my head, and I had to react in that moment. She stopped, and I managed to talk the man off the car. He started to threaten me. I radioed for help. I should have sooner, but things were escalating quicker than I thought they would. Within the next 10 minutes before help arrived, he managed to get one of the doors open and was trying to pull a 2-year-old boy out of his car seat. I tried to pin him into the open door and prevent him from getting the boy. 2 random dads saw what was happening and helped me keep the irate man corralled until help arrived. I let them take over so I could go back to directing traffic, which had gone a little haywire in the preceding 15 minutes. I heard the man yelling behind me and saw him attacking one of the other security guards. The other guards and I all rushed in and grabbed him. We took him down and held him down firmly and safely for about 15 minutes until the police arrived and arrested him. I received a subpoena, but he pled before the trial. I never learned what happened before or since then, but I just hope that family is okay now. I was guarding at a Walmart that had been gutted and used to store construction equipment for a construction company. That mostly involved just sitting in my car and occasionally circling the building. I didn't have to answer to anyone, or have anyone to check up on me either. One night, I was sitting in my car facing the building, when out of the shadows walked a woman towards the front of the building. She had no shoes on, short pajama-style shorts, and a thin white spaghetti-strap top. It was around 37 degrees or so I was immediately suspicious of this. I watched her for a while and noticed she was very alert, checking her surroundings constantly, like her head was on a swivel. All of a sudden, she darted behind a concrete column at the front of the building. A Honda had just pulled into the lot, and she'd noticed it before I did. She was keeping the column between the car and herself. The car was creeping by slowly, as if they were searching for someone. As it drove past her, she shifted so they couldn't see her behind the pillar. At this point, alarm bells were going off in my head. I got out of the car and the Honda left the area. The woman saw me, and she knew I saw her as well. She began running over to me. I asked her if she needed help and what was going on here. She told me to call the cops immediately, said she was scared, and started crying. I don't know how to describe it. It was not crying from sadness. It was more like tears of pure terror. Between the gasping, I started calling the cops. That Honda rolled back into the parking lot, and instantly she said, "Oh, never mind. It would be better if you didn't get involved." She started walking to the car like she'd just been found out. After that, she climbed into the vehicle, and that was that. It's been about 3 years since then, and I still think about it a lot. What was that about? Was it human trafficking, an abusive boyfriend? I have no clue. My blood runs cold when I stop and remember that night. I hope that girl is okay, but somehow I really doubt it. I work at Walmart, and we tend to get a lot of interesting customers in. One day, a man came in while I was doing cashier duty. I went to serve him. He stood at the counter for about 10 seconds without looking at me or interacting in any way. He then proceeded to run out of the store all of a sudden. About 2 hours later, I was cleaning out the men's bathrooms when he walked in again. I apologized and said I'd be just a moment to finish up my cleaning. Then I went to exit the bathroom with my cleaning supplies. He blocked the doorway and wouldn't let me pass by. After about a minute, he finally let me go. He then spent the next half an hour in the bathroom before exiting the store without purchasing anything. An hour later, you guessed it, he was back again, pacing back and forth at the front of the store. Obviously, this was all really suspicious. He ended up buying about $30 worth of stuff and then left the store without taking it with him. He just never returned. Several weeks later, I was waiting for my bus. I live very close to work. That was when I noticed the man walking by. He sees me, I see him, and he walked up and stood next to me for that 10-minute wait. When the bus finally arrived, he turned around and walked away. Now, as a young woman, this really scared the crap out of me, particularly when I drove past him the next day and saw him surrounded by police officers arresting him. There was a random man who happened to be outside while I was visiting a Walmart a few years back. He was disheveled and short. I want to say maybe 51 to 53. He was bald and mumbling to himself, walking sort of in a funny way. When I got to be about 3 feet from him, he suddenly turned around and knocked out the lady directly behind him. She was a perfect stranger just on her phone minding her own business. He knocked her out with one punch to the face and then ran up to a guy who was easily a foot taller than him. He tackled the man to the ground and began headbutting him and screaming, "Can you feel this now, Mary? Can you?" It was completely psycho. By the time the cops showed up, this guy was foaming at the mouth, yelling and covered in blood. 2 other people, 2 older men, had also been assaulted by him in the meantime. It was so nuts. The guy was obviously on some pretty strong stuff. I've never seen anyone before or after it lose it quite like that. This happened during one really cold night in the winter. It was well below freezing, and I lived in an apartment. I drove an older car which I'd had for a long time, and I knew that I had to start the engine a lot in the winter, especially if it was really cold. If I didn't start it up at least once a day, the battery would die on me. On this night, it was an especially cold night. I had used the car earlier in the day, but it had been hours since then, and I didn't want to take any chances. I decided I would run the engine for just a little bit before I went to bed. It was probably 11 p.m. or so at this time. I left my apartment and walked outside to the parking lot. My car was parked in front of my building. Several other cars would park there as well. There was an underground parking garage, but it costed extra money each month to park there. I didn't feel the need to do so. When I got outside, I was struck by just how very cold and quiet it was. Even though I was wearing my winter coat, a warm hat, and some gloves, I was still practically freezing. Heck, it was even kind of hard to breathe with all the wind blowing the cold air in my face. I got inside my car and started up the engine. It started, sure, but it sounded like it was just barely managing it. I realized I had definitely made a good choice coming out here. Usually, I think you're supposed to run your engine for 10 minutes or so at least, but I'm really not too sure. Probably depends on the vehicle or whatever. As I sat there in my car, the heat obviously wouldn't work much until the engine warmed up a little. I was absolutely freezing. I didn't want to sit there in my car for 10 minutes doing nothing, so I had the idea to go for a little drive around the area. That way, my engine would surely warm up faster due to actually driving, and I wouldn't just be sitting there bored out of my mind. I backed out and headed out of my apartment complex. My apartment had a little walking trail behind it, and then a patch of woods. On the other side of the woods was a neighborhood. The front of my apartment complex had a somewhat quiet road, leading to a busier one. My plan was to drive around, maybe the neighborhoods behind my apartment. I'd go for about 10 minutes, then go back. After I left, I took a right and went down a ways. I took another right, and after going down that street, I was in that neighborhood on the other side of the woods. There were a lot of different roads with many houses on them. They were all a bit spread out though, with many woods and grasslands in between. They were larger-sized properties. I drove down a few of these random roads. Nobody else was out driving really, which was to be expected at this time of night. I was mainly just paying attention to the heat in my car, waiting for it to fully warm up. I started to feel it going, which meant the engine was warming up too. I remember that I was driving through an area between one neighborhood and another. There were a lot of trees around this part. That's when I saw a man emerge from a wooded area, walking through the snow. He stepped out right into the middle of the street and stood in my lane. He was a ways away, but I started to slow down a little. This guy was wearing a really big coat and was appropriately dressed for the weather. He was just standing there right in the middle of the road. Now at first, I thought he was going to cross the street or something, but he didn't. It was unclear why he was just standing there. It seemed strange to even be out at this time and in this weather. I had to slow down all the way to a stop and wait for this guy to do whatever he was going to do. As I was stopped there on the road, the man looked at me and sort of waved me over. Something about this guy was strange. I wasn't sure what he was trying to get me to do. As I sat parked there, he began to walk over to me, then walked up to my driver's side window. He indicated that he wanted to say something to me. I rolled my window down just a bit. I thought the man would talk to me and explain what he was doing out here or something. But instead, as soon as I rolled the window down, he started to reach inside my car. It seemed like he was trying to grab my keys in the ignition. As an immediate reaction, I tried to bat his hand away and stomped on the gas. I went forward, and the man had to yank his hand out of my window. I drove away from the man, with him now standing on the side of the road looking at me. I figured that was enough driving around time for me. I headed back to my place. I was close to my apartment, just on the other side of it. I drove back around to the front and entered the parking lot. I got back to my spot where I parked in and turned off the car. As soon as I got out, though, I noticed the exact same man. He was emerging from the edge of the woods behind my apartment building. It was pretty far away from where I was now. He was coming out of an area near where I had just seen him. I didn't realize that he could probably see where I was going. I hurried and ran for my apartment door. I saw the man starting to run after me. I made it inside and went up to my place on the second floor. When I got up there, I went to my window. I looked out into the parking lot. I saw the man was now standing outside my vehicle. I watched him try to pry open the door, which of course was locked. I called the police and reported the incident. When I went back to the window, though, the man was already gone. The police came out and talked to me and said they would keep an eye out for the guy. Luckily, he wasn't able to break into my car or anything. I never saw him again after that. I'm not really sure what he was trying to do, but I'm glad that I managed to get away from him. I used to work at a gas station many years ago. I was the clerk in the convenience store that we had. It was open 24 hours, so as you can guess, I worked overnights. When I did, I would be all by myself. Now, the gas station was located across the street from some stores, such as Target and a few others. The area would get a lot of traffic during the day. A highway was also nearby, and the gas station was on a corner. At night, though, all the other businesses nearby closed by 10 or 11, and things would be very quiet until 6 a.m. or so. I worked almost every night for a while, and I was really getting used to being there overnights. It was mostly always pretty quiet. The gas station would get cars here and there, while people rarely came inside between the hours of midnight and 5 a.m. The average amount of people I'd actually interact with a night was around 5 or so. Really only 1 per hour. One night I was working and it was a typical quiet night. By now it was around 2 in the morning or so. I was behind the counter and nobody else was inside. No cars were at any of the gas pumps either. At one point I saw a car pulling in from the street. It was a white van, one of those typical creepy-looking ones that was kind of old as well. It slowly drove up and parked in one of the spaces out front. I expected someone to get out of the van and come inside, but instead the van just kind of sat there. I didn't really have anything better to do than to watch it, so I did so. I couldn't tell who was driving, but I soon realized they probably were not coming inside. They sat there for about 20 minutes. Eventually, the van just backed out. I thought it might leave, but instead it drove around to the side of the building. There were a few more parking spaces there, and it was now out of my line of sight. I honestly found this more than a little bit odd. In the middle of the night, it was sort of creepy as well. I always tried my best not to let anything scare me, though. After the van went to the side of the building, an hour or so went by. Now it was well past 3 a.m. Nobody came inside the store still. Only one car even stopped in to get gas. I noticed that somebody was walking up the sidewalk toward the entrance. It appeared to be a man, and he had come from the side where the van had gone before. Could this be the driver? He was wearing a large black winter jacket and had the hood up. He was looking down, so I couldn't make out his face at all. He made it to the doors and walked inside. After entering, the man walked to the right and away from me. He disappeared down a random aisle. I focused my attention back down to my phone. Several minutes went by. I looked up again and noticed the man was just standing there, about 40 feet away from me. He was facing me and looking my direction, with an angry look on his face. His hands were in his pockets. I was confused as to what he was doing. After glaring at me for 10 seconds, he didn't move or look away. I said hello to him and asked him if I could help him with anything. He didn't answer. He just kept standing there. I then asked him if he was okay. The man still didn't answer me. I was really confused and not sure what to do. After standing there for a few more seconds, the man then turned and slowly walked out. He walked back down the sidewalk and returned to the side of the building. Less than a minute later, I saw the white van drive away. I was really glad he was gone. The rest of my shift was pretty uneventful. Eventually, more people came in. I was trying to figure out what that guy had been doing for the rest of my shift. His behavior was just way too strange. Because I worked every night back then, 3 nights later I was working as well. It was about 2 a.m. or so. Once more, I was by myself, and there were no customers. It was very quiet when I saw a car pulling into the gas station. I soon realized it was an old white van just like the one from the other night. I remembered what happened and just sort of hoped it would not be the same guy. I was already feeling creeped out. The van drove around the gas pumps and over to the parking spaces out front. It then turned and started to back into one of the spaces. After it parked, the van just sat there again. All of a sudden, I heard one of the car doors open and saw what appeared to be the same man walking around. He went to the back of the van and opened those doors. A short time later, he emerged, holding something that looked like a crowbar. He closed the back doors of his van and started walking to the entranceway. He was wearing the same thing as the time prior. I had a bad feeling as I watched him walk up to the entrance doors. After getting inside, he turned and started walking to the back of the store and went out of my sight. Everything became quiet. About 5 minutes went by when I heard a crashing sound. It seemed like the man was striking something with his crowbar. I heard another sound as well. It was like he was just whacking things back there. After several moments of this, he seemed to start moving closer to me. I saw him appear in an aisle a ways away. I got out from behind the counter and ran out of the store. They weren't paying me enough to stay in there and deal with that. I ran all the way to my car and jumped inside, then called the police. I waited there with the doors locked, watching the store. I was parked behind the gas pump, so I was a decent way away from the store itself. After 3 or 4 minutes, I saw the guy leaving. He walked back out and jumped inside his van and drove off. Less than a minute after, the police arrived. I told them the man was gone. I went inside the store to see it had been completely smashed up. Everything was messed up from the guy whacking it with his crowbar. It was like he had gone on a rampage. We watched the whole thing unfold on surveillance tapes. The guy was just whacking anything and everything. Then he calmly left like nothing had happened. It was the craziest thing I had ever seen. After that incident, the police investigated to try and look for the guy. They also had a police officer at the store overnight for the next week or so. The guy didn't come back, and I didn't work there for much longer. I'm really glad I quit that job actually, because ever since that happened, I was always really nervous working there at night. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.